Hello and welcome back to climatedebate.co.uk. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what's behind the current green agenda, the net zero agenda, and a little bit about the history and thinking underpinning net zero and net zero policies and the forces driving them, and about some key points between their inspiration and realization as policies. There's much more to this story, of course. This is not a complete history at all, but it is a counter to the misconception that the climate debate begins and ends in science. And on that point, I want to address first a false framing of the climate debate as one between scientists and deniers, with scientists adhering to the belief that climate change is real and deniers denying that fact. This is a false framing. It's a very political and ideological framing, but it is the misconception that you will see in most mainstream coverage of the climate debate. And at climatedebate.co.uk, we believe it's false because we believe that there are 5 fundamental categories of claims made in the climate debate. So there's a constellation of claims here that are grouped into 5 categories. And it is green ideology that typically makes an equivalence of climate change and climate crisis. These claims progress from global warming through to climate policy, but frequently commentators in the media and politicians confuse climate change and climate crisis, but they're completely distinct categories. So while there may be good evidence for global warming and some good evidence for climate change, there is no evidence for a climate crisis at all. So this creates the risk that climate policy will do more harm than good. We go into more detail on this on our website. Please do check it out. So I'll just raise 4 points here. There is no evidence that climate change is causing an increasing amount of economic losses. There is no evidence that climate change is pushing more people in the world into extreme poverty. There's no evidence that climate change is causing more people to suffer from communicable diseases or other diseases of poverty. And there's no evidence that climate change is causing a loss of agricultural productivity anywhere in the world. Yet these are all things that are supposed to represent the climate crisis. And this is really important for understanding the history of the climate agenda. Environmental change and even harm isn't always a crisis, but it's always how Greens have presented their claims from the earliest days of the Green movement. So back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the early Green movement was not talking about global warming and climate change. They were talking about population growth, resource depletion, and pollution buildup. And they believed that these things would lead to the breakdown of society. That's essentially the same plot as today, but maybe a slightly different script. The limits to growth hypothesis were published by the Club of Rome, a very influential think tank of scientists and billionaires, claimed that society stood on the brink of collapse. But as we can see in our map of the climate debate, it's often ideology that is making the links between environmental change and crisis, not science. The same is true now as it was then. And that ideology was hidden behind or embedded within computer models. And the Club of Rome was famously the first to use computer simulations to make predictions about the imminent collapse of society. And they used those predictions to make demands to change society, to change the entire global economy, and to create powerful global institutions to regulate global society. But all of the predictions that they had made have failed. History itself has debunked the limits to growth hypothesis and the population bomb. As we've seen in the previous slides, the world's population has increased, but people are living longer, healthier and wealthier lives. And there's been no reflection really on the failure of the green movement's claims since the 1970s. Instead of addressing those failures, they've moved all of their stories into the global warming narrative. So how to explain how this rather grim outlook for humanity has persisted? Well, it turns out it has very little to do with science and a lot to do with the money and power that is underpinning the green ideological movement. And so at that time in the 1970s, it was extremely wealthy individuals such as Morris Strong and the Rockefeller family who were able to use their money and power to put environmental politics on the global political agenda for the first time.
I believe that the general public has sensed this. They have realized, I think, when they see a dirty beach, when a little child points up the fact that, Daddy, look at the water's dirty, when they sense the fact that despite the tremendous material progress that has been made in some of our societies, that actual living conditions have deteriorated. The number of alternatives available for the citizen in his private life in many of the cities of the world have actually diminished. He realizes that pure material economic growth is not the answer, and it makes him confront the basic questions of values.
So Morris Strong was the convener of the first UN Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 and the UN Environment Programme. And he states there that material economic growth is not the answer to the world's problems, which is a very easy thing for someone as wealthy as Morris Strong to say. It's very easy to be against material economic growth when you're a multi-millionaire or even a billionaire. And so from the outset, the green political agenda exists only by virtue of the generosity of the world's wealthiest people. And that should cause us to take a slightly more skeptical view of what the green agenda, never mind climate science, is really about. So fast forwarding to the era of the UK climate change agenda, and net zero, that is to say, here's David Miliband, then Secretary of State for DEFRA, explaining what climate legislation is really about.
The bill will have impacts for government itself and the way it runs its own operations, for businesses who should now have clear and consistent messages about the way in which the UK is determined to lead the fight against climate change, and also for individuals, because in the end, this isn't something that governments and businesses can do alone. We need the choices that individuals make about electricity, about heat, and about transport, also to respect environmental limits and to ensure that we live within our means environmentally.
So David Miliband echoes the limits to growth hypothesis that we have encountered, the limits of material and economic growth, and echoes Morris Strong's view that material economic growth is not the answer to our problems, which is something of a departure from Labour Party principles, or traditionally or in the past. The Labour Party has sort of championed the interests, the material interests of the working class, but now David Miliband wants to say that economic growth isn't the answer, which again is a very easy thing to say if you're in a position that David Miliband is in. David Miliband left politics after his brother won the leadership campaign for the Labour Party, and he walked into a $500,000 a year job. So what takes a Labour minister away from the traditional values and principles of his party to a position that argues against improving the condition of the working class? So one answer may be given in this rather candid presentation by Bryony Worthington, former Friends of the Earth campaigner.
So when David Miliband arrived and said, right, it looks like we're going to have a climate change bill, who do we know in the department who can help us with this? Someone said, well, Bryony wrote the document that Friends of the Earth that kicked this whole thing off. Why don't we get her in and see if she can help? So I got shifted off I was doing some work on public awareness and a campaign about educating people about climate change, and told, right, you're going to be part of a team of civil servants. We want you to draft a bill.
Worthington was made a baroness for her actions, and she had organised the Friends of the Earth to lobby politicians for a climate bill. And what she reveals there is that there was something of an arms race between David Miliband in the Labour government and David Cameron in the leader of the Conservative Party to champion the climate agenda. And that campaign was very, very successful. Only a small number of MPs, I think between 3 and 5 MPs, voted against it, and Climate Change Act is passed with practically zero opposition in 2008, and that commits the UK to an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. So this isn't net zero yet, but what it shows is that governments and political parties are not really producing their own policy agendas, but they are turning to green organizations, NGOs, to determine what their agendas are going to be. And this isn't unique to the UK. The same was happening in Europe. There's a very powerful philanthropic fund in the United States called Climate Works, which was establishing in the 2000s a European wing called the European Climate Foundation. And this was going to channel large philanthropic donations towards green campaigning organizations. And what their annual report in 2010 reveals is that they were able to walk into a European official's office and were asked to draft European legislation in much the same way as Bryony Worthington from Friends of the Earth was asked to draft UK climate policy. The European Climate Foundation were asked to draft EU policy. And so if we take that broader view of climate change and the green agenda, we see again that the policy agenda is simply being handed over to billionaire philanthropists who get to design energy policy without the public's involvement. How is this possible? Well, one answer might be that there has been something of a decline in democratic engagement since the 1990s. The 2001 general election was the first, perhaps in history, but certainly since the end of World War II, in which more people did not vote than voted for the winning party. And by quite a large margin, more than 40% of people didn't register their vote in 2001. And that's been the case ever since. More people have not voted than have voted for the winning party. And that may be because the public are simply being pushed out of politics. People aren't being denied a vote, but it does seem that there is less to vote for. Politicians began offering the public less and less and became copies of each other. And maybe that's because politicians were turning to NGOs for inspiration rather than asking the public for their consent. And this is really epitomized in 2015 when the leaders of the political parties signed a pledge that they would not contest climate policies. They would work together across party lines to agree carbon budgets in accordance with the Climate Change Act. And this is to really neglect their duties as leaders of political parties to contest legislation and to contest political ideas and to represent the public's interests and the differences of opinion that exist within society about how it should be governed. This campaign, Show the Love campaign, was organised by a very influential think tank, works closely in Westminster with politicians of all parties, called the Green Alliance. And this cross-party consensus really was the work of the Green Alliance, and so is much of climate policy. So a few years later, the Climate Change Act gets an amendment to net zero. So this increases the target of the Climate Change Act from an 80% reduction by 2050 to an effectively 100% reduction by 2050. And MPs passed this statutory instrument without a vote after a debate that lasted just 90 minutes. So MPs pretty much just gave themselves 90 minutes to discuss the next 30 or 40 years of climate and energy policy that we will all have to suffer. But both politicians and the Green Alliance knew that the public does not support this agenda. And they knew it because their own research shows it. This is a report produced by the Green Alliance in 2018, and they quote politicians and MPs telling them that the public aren't interested. They say they don't have conversations with the public about climate change. So they know that people, given the choice, aren't going to vote for radical green policies, and they're not going to vote for the green agenda. And so they say there's a need for policies that build engagement and public support rather than presuming the support from the electorate. And their answer is to find a way to circumvent democracy, the voter, and to form a climate assembly to do that, and which was also a demand of the Extinction Rebellion movement at the same time. And I'll come back to the climate assembly in a minute. But the reason that the public aren't going to vote for the net zero agenda is because it's an incredibly draconian form of policy. And the euphemism that politicians and policy wonks use for these draconian policies is behavior change. And behavior in this sense means everything between what you eat, how you heat your home, and how you travel. According to the UK Climate Change Committee, 63% of emissions reduction will come from people behaving differently, behavior change. But what behavior change really means is government telling people how to behave and what they're entitled to. As Maurice Strong and David Miliband made clear, people don't really get any choice in their behavior. People don't support the policy agenda. They haven't been given the right to express their views on the policy agenda, but their behavior is going to be changed all the same. So people aren't going to vote for behavior change because the costs are going to be extremely high. People will lose freedoms, quality of life, and the comforts that they've grown used to and have a reasonable expectation of. And until now, until the 2010s, most of the climate agenda has been dealing with the supply side of energy, building lots of wind farms and solar farms and closing down coal-fired power stations and the such like. But now the climate agenda, the net zero agenda now requires a lot more of the public, much more of the behavior change. The government at this stage really has no idea about how to force emissions reduction targets on an unwilling public. So what they did was they essentially sacked the electorate and they convened the climate assembly. And they did this because the Green lobby told politicians that the public could be made to support the policy agenda. And they believed that if they convened a climate assembly, ordinary people would recognize themselves in the 100 or so people that were in the climate assembly. And they would see that the climate assembly had chosen the policies of net zero. And then they would, out of recognizing themselves in the position of the climate assembly members, would support the net zero agenda. But the climate assembly was convened by Parliament and a number of civil society organisations which were also funded by the European Climate Foundation that I discussed a moment ago. The climate assembly didn't convene itself. It was formed out of discussions between parliamentary groups and so-called civil society organisations. So who are the European Climate Foundation? These are the European Climate Foundation's philanthropic funders that it declares on its website. But if we look more closely at an internal review that was leaked to the internet, these are the funders, according to that auditor's report. The organisations that are underlined in red are funders that aren't shown on the European Climate Foundation's website. That shows that 36 million euros of anonymous donations went to the European Climate Foundation in 2020. Many green organisations, some of them funded by the ECF, make a great deal about dark money funding organisations in interventions in the climate debate. But it turns out that they too have rather opaque funding relationships. One of those major investors to the ECF is Christopher Hone, whose philanthropic fund, the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, gave $200 million to climate organizations in 2021. And also notable here is Mike Bloomberg's philanthropic fund, Bloomberg Philanthropies. Mike Bloomberg has given billions of dollars to the green movement in recent years. And this is the pattern you'll see from nearly every so-called civil society organization. They are almost always exclusively funded by a small number of philanthropic foundations on behalf of the billionaires that support them. And they have almost no evidence of public support at all. And these are the organizations that ECF admits to funding. And there are lots more of them, but ECF simply don't say where their money goes in any more detail than this. And I've highlighted a few of those organizations in red here. There's the Green Alliance, which I've pointed out earlier, is behind a lot of lobbying in Parliament. And there's the Conservative Environment Network, which is a group of Conservative MPs and local councillors, and Client Earth, which I'll discuss in a moment, and UK 100, which I'll also go on to talk about. So how does all this money get used? Well, the ECF doesn't explain where all of its money goes, but here, for example, is an organisation that wasn't listed on its website, the Friends of the Earth Europe. Friends of the Earth is perhaps the closest thing that the Green Movement has to a membership organisation, but it isn't entirely transparent about where its money comes from and where its money goes. For example, the UK branch of Friends of the Earth doesn't explain where its money comes from and how it uses it. But Friends of the Earth Europe, which is a little bit more transparent, turns out to have these philanthropic funders and also is funded by the European Union itself, which makes something of a mockery of the notion of a non-governmental organization, because it turns out these NGOs are in fact funded by governments as well as billionaires. And they are, it turns out, paid to lobby by the people they lobby. And that turns out to include setting up what appear to be grassroots campaigns using their membership. But of course, if it's governments and billionaires funding these grassroots organizations, to what extent are they really grassroots organizations at all? As critics have pointed out, organizations like Friends of the Earth are fake charities, sock puppets, essentially, the mouthpieces for governments and billionaire philanthropists. And a second way that the money is used is to influence the media narrative. So we see here The Guardian, which often whinges about dark money influencing the climate agenda, but it itself takes substantial donations to support its journalism. It doesn't say how much, but it does claim that The Guardian is reader-funded, not billionaire-backed in its adverts. And that's clearly a lie. We see the European Climate Foundation supporting its environment coverage. And it's worth noting that Mike Bloomberg, who I've mentioned earlier, is already a media tycoon controlling a significant amount of the global news agenda. And the third way in which this money is used is using the law to enforce climate policies. And this was predicted in 2008 in the debates about the Climate Change Act.
The sole effect of enshrining in statute will be that the government's policies will be open to judicial review. Judges will be asked to assess whether measures introduced will be likely or not to be effective in meeting their targets. Now, I don't have a great deal of faith in ministers of this government, and perhaps ministers of any government, to meet these targets, but the idea that judges should decide policies costing billions and billions of pounds when not being accountable to the electorate for those billions which they might decide need incurring fills me with foreboding.
Peter Lilly successfully predicted that the outcome of climate legislation would just be to allow NGOs on behalf of green billionaires to enforce what the government had been unable to implement. And here we see that the Children's Investment Fund, which is Christopher Hone's philanthropic organisation, has $83.6 million currently committed to climate litigation projects and organisations. And one of the main beneficiaries of that funding is an organisation called Client Earth. Client Earth takes the UK government and other governments to court and companies to court over things such as air pollution. But one of the mysterious things about this legal campaign is that it itself is also the beneficiary of £4 million pounds of government funding, or let's say public funding. So the UK taxpayer is in fact funding the legal campaign that represents green billionaires' interests to take the UK government to court to impose policies on the public, back onto the taxpayer, which gives the lie to the claim that these green organisations are in any kind of opposition to the government or is holding the government to account. And the fourth way in which green philanthropy is used is to try to get financial markets to work as governance. And this has been a major emphasis of both Christopher Hone and Mike Bloomberg's philanthropy. They've funded many divestment campaigns, which asks investors, financial institutions, and shareholders to move their money out of fossil fuel companies and into stock which is ESG compliant, essentially telling shareholders that their assets are at risk both from climate change and from climate policy, and that they should take their money away from fossil fuel companies and should persuade them to withdraw services to fossil fuel companies. The main consequence of this has been to increase the cost of capital for fossil fuel projects, and this has caused a significant lack of investment over the last decade. And this is arguably one of the major factors of the supply crisis that was compounded by the lockdowns, pushing prices up. So, for example, you may have seen recently that HSBC is to end its financial services to oil and gas fields operating in the North Sea. And this is a direct consequence of ESG lobbying through organisations that are funded and founded by Bloomberg and Hone's philanthropy. And Bloomberg and Hone's ESG campaigning has been so successful largely because Bloomberg was appointed by Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And the TCFD was convened to develop the principles of the E in ESG, first as voluntary policies and now increasingly as mandatory standards of reporting. And ESG has been pushed into central banks and financial ministries and governments by the UK government's support. And the fifth way in which this money is used is by developing ideas about how to redesign society through lobbying and through academic and fake civil society organizations. Now, there are many ways in which this net zero agenda will affect our lives, but the one example I'm going to use now is the low traffic neighborhood schemes that have popped up under lockdowns. And that was really quite a cynical move on the green movement's behalf to use lockdowns to advance the green agenda while everyone was locked in their homes. And this is clearly an attempt to restrict the use of private transport. And one of the main organizations behind the LTN's initiative and the subsequent ideas about restricting the use of cars is C40 Cities, which claims to be a global network of mayors who are committed to confronting the climate crisis, which, as we've explained, doesn't exist. But rather than being an association of mayors, as it claims, it turns out its strategic funders are, again, Mike Bloomberg and Christopher Hone. Another organization behind the LTNs and other restrictions on the use of the car is UK 100, which claims to be a network of local government leaders. But it too is funded by Bloomberg and Hone through the European Climate Foundation, as was shown earlier. And there we can see some of the members of the UK 100, and it includes Oxford City and Oxfordshire County Councils, which are in the news at the moment because of their policies, which some people have called a climate lockdown. And here's a third organisation that claims to be a movement, an alliance of mayors throughout the world to deal with the climate issue. And Oxford is a member of that. also again. But it turns out Mike Bloomberg is the chair, along with EU technocrat Frans Timmermans. So again, we see, rather than being a grassroots organization or an organization that reflects the populations of the cities which mayors are responsible for, it's just a deal between a billionaire and an undemocratic political institution. So when these policies are then imposed on people, they state their objections in polls and in so-called consultations. Quite clearly, people don't want these radical changes to their lives. But fake civil society organizations funded by green billionaires are simply more powerful, and local authorities and governments aren't really interested in what the public think of their plans and the plans designed for them by green civil society organizations. And the truth of this relationship really is given by Alok Sharma MP and president of COP26.
Well, look, I mean, on that basis and on that description, I very much consider myself part of the Green Alliance gang. And there are actually reasons to be optimistic when it comes to climate action, because I do believe we're at a vital inflection point where the views of governments, of businesses, and civil society are coalescing in a determination to tackle climate change.
And so this is a compact between governments and businesses and civil society organizations. This is the political reality underpinning the green agenda. The public has been excluded from it deliberately, and Alok Sharma makes this very clear by omitting them from his understanding of the green agenda as being driven by governments, businesses, and civil society organizations. But as we've discussed, civil society organizations are not democratic organizations. They're just organizations that are funded by businesses and governments. So really, Alok Sharma's talking about the convergence of governments and business, excluding the public. So what we've discussed is that green policies and the net zero agenda puts green ideology before observational evidence. And this really ignores the history of the green movement and its demands for radical changes to society and the failures of its scientific predictions. The green movement is now, and it always has been, driven by wacky green billionaires who believe it is up to them to design society in their own images. Green organizations, including, I would add, many academic research organizations, are just PR fronts for this political agenda. They're not grassroots, democratic public organizations. Billionaires have simply been able to buy nearly all of civil society, and this has pushed the public out of politics. They have no representation, and they're ignored by all levels of government, local, national, and at the EU and at the global levels. And this compact between government, businesses, and fake civil society organizations has created an extremely unhealthy democratic deficit. You might agree with some of the green agenda, but your agreement with it isn't really required. And if you disagree with any part of it, you'll be ignored. So the only way to fix this is to organize democratically and demand democratic accountability and democratic control of policy. We need to say we don't share these utopian designs for society, and we want these issues to be debated. We don't want diktats from a self-appointed green clerisy, and we don't want rule by eco-billionaires. Thanks very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please subscribe to our mailing list and social media channels, and please share our work.